Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am Misty Luminais. I'm here with Leslye Huff for the Voicing in Action Project, a project of the Social Justice Institute of Case Western Reserve University. Today we are at Case Western Reserve University's campus. So, Leslye, tell me about yourself and the history of your family.
What a big question. Well, what would you like to know?
Why don't we start with your parents?
Okay. My father was Conley Raleigh, born in Pittsburgh. My mother, Madeline Lincoln Bowden, was born in a little town called Athens, Alabama. And my father had, I think, 8 siblings, some of whom I knew, some died before I got to know them. His mother actually died on my birthday. I was 4, and I knew his dad, my grandfather. He was a deacon in a Baptist church in my neighborhood. My mother's mother, Leslye May Lincoln Bly. I'm sort of named after her, but I'm actually named after her father, who is Leslye Lincoln. And she lived with us in our home in Pittsburgh. So I was born in Pittsburgh and grew up there. Went to Duquesne University. My elementary school setting, as I said, was in a little town called that we called Lincoln Park. It was part of a larger township called Penn Hills Township. Our elementary school was about, I would say, 80% black, and there were maybe 7 elementary schools in the town of Penn Hills. My elementary school's name was Lincoln Park, and then our elementary schools flowed into one of 2 middle schools. We called them junior highs at the time. And I went to Seneca Junior High, which was about 95% white. And then on to Penn Hills High School, which again was about 95% white.
All right, let's back up just a little bit. You said your mom was from Alabama.
Yes.
How did she end up in Pittsburgh?
Oh, now that's an interesting story. My grandmother had a sister whose name is Bredonia, and Bredonia married a minister who relocated to Pittsburgh, and they were a little concerned about her being that far away from home. So my grandmother relocated to be with her, to be closer to her sister, and Mom finished her high school years in Alabama. She'd come up in the summertime, or she would visit during breaks. She wanted to finish school in Trinity High School because it was one of those pretty special schools for African American kids in the South that was pretty novel and progressive. Her sister, on the other hand, chose to come to Pittsburgh and finished her high school time in, is that true? I think she finished all but her senior year in Penn Hills. So then after graduation, Mom moved to Pittsburgh to be with her mom, and a couple of years later, I was born.
So, how did your mom get from Alabama to Pittsburgh? Was she taking the train?
Oh, the train, yes.
Did she ever tell you about that?
My grandmother told me more about the trains than my mother. My grandmother, who we called Mama, talked a lot about how the soldiers would allow her to sit. She had a stiff leg from an early illness, and so she was she talked a little bit about, not very much though, about the segregation on those trains, but she, you have to understand, my family, my mother and my grandmother told stories of transcendence about the South. Whatever stories they told me about the South always had an ending that was pleasurable. So, but it's also of note that they didn't go back. They didn't visit, we didn't visit until I think my first visit to Athens was in 1971. So I was 21 years old, and I just hopped a ride with someone who was going back because there were families in Ohio that traveled back and forth to Alabama yearly. My family was not one of them.
And what were the races of your parents?
My mother's African American. My father is too. My stepfather is African American as well.
So your mother and your father, were they married?
My mother did not marry my father. They were engaged when I was conceived, and she chose not to marry him. And a couple of years later, she met my stepfather, and they were married.
And what is his name?
Ernest Bowden.
So your last name is Huff. How did that happen?
I got married. I got married in 1974, excuse me. No, that's not true. It was 1973, but it was December. So.
Okay, so before we get to 1973, we're going to back up a little bit more.
Okay.
You said there were 7 elementary schools in your township.
In Penn Hills, yes.
How is it that you ended up at the predominantly African American one? Was that based on neighborhoods?
Oh, it's an interesting question. Years ago, I used to think of my neighborhood as being segregated. And then I realized that it was not. My township was segregated, but my neighborhood was multicultural. Penn Hills is a pretty large area, as witnessed by the fact that we had one high school with 1,014 graduates in my year, in 1968. So that can tell you it's a pretty big school. Most of Penn Hills was white, almost exclusively white. And then Lincoln Park was the area that I grew up in, had African Americans, it had Native Americans, it had Russian Jewish people, even in those days. It had Italians and Jewish people. It had goodness. I mean, there were so many different kinds of people in my little section of Penn Hills. Mostly, probably a large, maybe 50-60% were black, maybe even more. But it was a mixed community. So in those days, neighborhood schools prevailed. So Lincoln Park was the neighborhood school, and you could walk to it, and about a half mile, and that's where I went to elementary school.
And the friends that you had in school, were they the same friends that you had at home?
In elementary school?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, because they were neighborhood kids.
Okay. And then when you went to junior high, you said there was 2 junior highs in the whole town?
2 junior highs in Penn Hills, yes.
Okay.
All of the kids from Lincoln Park went to one junior high,
Mm-hmm.
and then the other junior high had other kids from different parts of Penn Hills.
So was it strictly numerical that you went from an 85%, if your elementary school was 85% black, all of those students going into the junior high proportionately just became that much smaller because
Exactly.
the school was so much bigger.
Exactly.
Okay. And how was that shift?
It was funny and sad. It was annoying and it was wonderful. All of those things. One annoying but funny story, because I went to middle school in 1963. So it was before the Civil Rights Act and before all of this stuff. There was one youngster in our neighborhood. His first name is Johnny, and I can't remember his last name. I wish I could. His mother was white and his father was black. And he had a younger brother who was the son of both of them. What Johnny didn't know was that his stepfather was not his actual father. So his biological father was white. So Johnny was actually at least would have been considered white. So the first day of school, we're all in 7th grade and we're all on the same bus, and we get there, and frankly, we had been kind of prepared to experience all kinds of different things, including racism. And Johnny went into the boys' room, and the white kids from other parts of Penn Hills were talking about all the ins that were coming to the school and how they'd never seen one, or they had, or whatever, just making some fairly rude comments about African Americans coming to the school. And what was interesting about Johnny was that he worked with his stepfather, who he considered his birth father, lifting transmissions. I mean, they were mechanics, so Johnny was really, really big and buff, you know. Johnny, I think there were 4 kids making those snide remarks, racist remarks, and Johnny beat them all up Now, that's not funny, obviously, but what happened next was funny, and the whole neighborhood heard about it because Johnny's mother and father told the whole neighborhood about it. The principal called Johnny and his mother and father in to see him. He made Johnny leave that day, and he called the mother and father in, and he sat privately with the mother and father and explained to them that if they just had explained to Johnny that he was white, he wouldn't have been in trouble because he wouldn't have fought. Now, all of Lincoln Park laughed about that. I mean, we just thought it was the funniest thing. And, you know, of course, the only sad part was that Johnny found out that his stepfather was not his birth father. But it didn't touch Johnny's spirit at all. I mean, he said, I would have beat him up anyway. But that was in 1963. There were other things of that sort that happened. And one actually happened to me. I was walking, the 7th graders were all in, our homerooms were in the auditorium. And so I was walking in with a group of my friends to my seat, and a girl in front of us tripped. She turned around and I guess she looked at everyone to see who the smallest person was, and she said that I was the one who tripped her. No one had tripped her. She just tripped on her own. And so she smacked me, and I smacked her back, and pretty hard, actually. And a teacher saw it, and she called us both over, and she told us she was to get to our homerooms, and after homeroom she was going to report us. She took our names and all of that stuff. So I went to my homeroom teacher and I said, may I be excused? I have to go to the office. And I went down to the office ahead of the teacher and explained what happened. And the girl who was coming in was actually a repeat 7th grader, so the school knew her, and they suspended her and they didn't suspend me. So I think it was smart to go in and preempt all of that. And that's that's the way I tried to handle everything while I was there.
So did you keep your same core of neighborhood friends and the friends that you had in elementary school, or did your social circles expand when you went into junior high?
Both. I kept the same friends in my neighborhood. We had By seventh grade, I had helped start a youth choir, and I had a small singing group of folks from my neighborhood. But I also made new friends and associated with whoever I liked. It was difficult, though. Another example of the difficulty based on the overall societal norms. We were very musical. The whole actually, all of Penn Hills was very, very musical town. Lincoln Park in particular, we had an elementary school choir that sang in harmony. I mean, you don't get that in elementary schools, especially now. But even then, it was novel. And we had, in our little town, we had a music and arts club. So a lot of us took music lessons, piano, violin, voice lessons. And so we were prepared to be full participants in the musical programs of the middle school and the high school. So one of the first things you had to do in middle school you had to try out for the choir, and you had to try out to be one of the student accompanists. And I will never forget one of our best pianists in our neighborhood. She was told that she'd have to sight read some music, and she was prepared to do that. But she found out that one or two of the other kids who were also trying out had the music in advance. So she didn't make it. I've been sight reading since before first grade, so they couldn't trick me. And I became a member of the choir, and ultimately in high school, I'll tell you about that later, that caused some interesting dilemmas in the high school and ultimately ended my music career, actually. But so the little rift that happened in our community was that a lot of my Lincoln Park friends tried really hard to compete in unfair circumstances, but a lot of them just gave up after a while. It's like, it's rigged. We're just not going to do it. Physically, it was rigged. Very few of us in Lincoln Park had cars. In order to get to my high school, in order to get to the middle school or the high school from my house on public transportation, I had to ride a bus that had no schedule from Lincoln Park into the city of Pittsburgh, get 2 more buses back out to Penn Hills to my school. Yeah. So if there were after-school activity, and there were no after-school buses that brought kids back, it was 5 miles, I think, to our high school. And sometimes we would walk it if the school bus didn't come. And because of the hills in Pittsburgh, if it was a snowy day, it might not come. So you stand there for an hour and a half waiting for a bus, and then still have to walk to school because you dare not go home in case the bus gets there 2 hours late. Then you're counted as an unexcused absence. So even the environment itself, the structure of the environment made it difficult. And that's where my mom and my grandmother, and to some degree my stepfather, came in. Because no matter what, if I wanted to do something, they found a way to help me do it. My mother had a pretty extreme case of infantile rheumatoid arthritis, which meant that when she divorced my stepfather when I was about 8. He was still very friendly and would come around from time to time, pretty regularly actually. Remained a friend of the family until he died, but didn't always have a car, mostly didn't have a car. And so Mom if she couldn't walk to a bus stop and wait, she'd get a jitney, which was an illegal taxi. And they would take me to my choir rehearsal. They would take me to play rehearsals and other things that I needed to do. She just made it happen, and wouldn't let the difficulties that were certainly, some were intentional, some were inadvertent, keep us from doing what we set out to do.
I should have asked this earlier. Do you have any siblings?
I do, yes. I have a brother, a baby brother, who is, I think, just turned 60. I taught him to walk. He's only 4 years younger than me, but 4.5. But I did teach him to walk. And I have a sister who I did not discover until I was 36. Yeah.
One day I'll have to tell you about my sisters.
Well, this one, I was still in elementary school when I met her, but I didn't know she was my sister. There was a bully in my elementary school, a family of bullies. And the bully who was in my grade, in my class actually, everyone called Beardy. I don't know why, but I was the only one who didn't. I called him by his given name, Gerald, and he never bullied me. He just walked around me and would pick on somebody else. So I guess that was the reason my elementary school teacher asked me to help him get ready for a test that he had missed, because she figured he wouldn't bother me. I'm surmising that's what it was. It could have been also because I'm brilliant or something, but I think it was because he wouldn't beat me up. But one day it was almost time for him to take the test. We had been studying and studying after school, and it was the day before the test. And the 7th graders got off the school bus as we were coming out of the elementary school. And his sister, who was also a bully, she was in 7th grade, came over and tried to force me to give him the answers to the test so that he would be sure to pass it. Well, I didn't know what the test was going to look like, number one, but even if I did, I wouldn't have given him the answers to the test. So she started pummeling me. She was just, totally beating me up. And this girl came over off the same bus, so she was in 7th grade, grabbed her off of me and said, "Pick on someone your own size." And they started fighting, and I ran home. Well, I found out her name was Cynthia Ross, and then I never saw her again. So years went by, and I'd already moved to Cleveland, and I was living with Mary, and had 2 kids, and I got a call from a person who said she was my aunt, and she was my father's sister. Well, my father was dead by then, and I didn't know, I had never heard this sister's name. And she said, "And I've been trying to contact your sister too." So I said, "What sister?" So she told me the woman's name, and it rang familiar, but I couldn't place it until I took the number and called her, and it was the same girl. It was the same woman who had protected me, saved my life, I thought at the time. She didn't know I was her sister either. So we've found each other. And Beardy killed himself, actually. He jumped off a bridge and killed himself. Tragic. So
junior high, was that 7th and 8th grade?
7th, 8th, and 9th.
Okay. So when you made the transition to high school, you intimated that there were some other rifts in the community.
Oh. Well, before I even got to high school, my first few encounters with white boys included them telling stories about how their fathers over the summer before 7th grade had taken them into Pittsburgh to brothels And that's where they met their first black woman. Yeah. So hearing these stories. That was 1963. Which I think prompted, the teachers couldn't help but hear some of this stuff. And seeing my reaction to it, my 7th grade science teacher wrote in my little book that I was a sweet little lady at all times.
I mean, did that sexualize you from a young age?
What do you mean sexualize me?
I mean, like, did boys in your grade all of a sudden see you as a sexual object?
Well, if you hear that story from a 7th grade Italian boy or Hungarian boy, and they also tell you that their soft porn was National Geographic, you just about know what they're thinking of you when, I'm sitting there 4'11" and was wearing a larger bra size than my mother when I was in 3rd grade. So, yeah, it made me know about them. It taught me a lot about them, who they were, and the confusion in their heads. Mm-hmm. Kind of made me sad for them, too.
Do you feel like it placed you at risk?
No, I never thought of myself at risk. I always thought of myself as someone who could take care of herself. So, no. Wow.
Any ideas where that attitude came from?
Oh, I'm so clear. My mother, my grandmother, my stepfather, my church.
Right. So you get to high school and the Civil Rights Act has been passed and the Voter Right Act has been passed. Did those national legal remedies for racism have any impact on your experience in a predominantly white town?
Well, I didn't experience the town. I experienced Lincoln Park and school in the town. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different thing. I knew more about the library that was 5 miles away in Pittsburgh than I knew where things were in Penn Hills. But I want to go back to two experiences I had as an elementary school person. One was this was before elementary school, I was 5. And my first public memory, meaning a memory of something that happened outside of my town, my little town of Lincoln Park, which seemed very big at the time, was the picture of Emmett Till's face on Jet magazine. And I remember my brother wasn't walking yet. The neighbors, the community was vibrating about that. Constant worry. It was, and I've written about this in my journal, it was almost like they couldn't promise that it wouldn't happen to another black kid, so they just promised to worry about it instead. It was like that. My next door neighbor was born into slavery. And she had a very, very different take on civil rights. She said, we'd see her, we called her Miss Doc. Her husband was called Mr. Doc. I don't know why neither one of them were docs. I don't know. Please, I'm so sorry. I'm going to pause it for a moment.
We were talking about Miss Doc and Mr. Doc.
Oh, yeah. So Miss Doc told my mother in my presence, I was standing there with her holding her hand actually, and Miss Doc said, they bought us. They bought and paid for us. They owns us. You know, she couldn't see what all the ruckus was about. And I wish I had been old enough to ask her questions about that, but I never did. But she's the only person that I know of back in those days that didn't seem to be very much active and involved in improving our neighborhood, making services, getting services into Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park didn't have sewage system when I was a young child, and the people there made it happen. They went out to the city hall, apparently. I was not there physically because I was too young, but and protested until they got a sewage system. They, you know, just those kinds of things. The whole neighborhood was actively involved. Everybody voted. School didn't happen on voting day. It was closed. The school was closed because that's where we voted. So people were where they voted. I was a child, but it was very, very important to everyone. And it didn't matter what station of life you were in. Could be an alcoholic like 364 days a year and then vote on the 365th day. Everybody voted. Yeah, so that was the one thing, with seeing Emmett Till's face on that magazine. So, flash forward to high school.
Well, can I ask you, before we do that, when you said that everyone went and protested for services, was that framed in terms of civil rights or in terms of race, or was that like the community coming together? You said the community was mixed.
Oh, I think everyone thought of it as racist.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to be black to see that something's racist. And by far the leadership of that was black people, but everyone saw it. Yes, the leadership was almost exclusively black.
Okay. You were saying you were going to go to high school?
Oh, yes. So then I went to high school, and it became more and more difficult for me to explain to my peers in Lincoln Park why I kept trying to do things. But I couldn't help myself. I had to try to do things because I wanted to do them.
By do things, you mean what?
Well, like trying out for the various highly esteemed a cappella choir. It was a 150 voice choir, and very few African Americans got into it, ironically. There were fewer singers who read music in my neighborhood than people who played piano or violin. So that was one reason, but it wasn't the primary reason. As I said, the things were sort of stacked against succeeding. But I became a member of the a cappella choir as a freshman, which was just about impossible to do. Very few people did. But I read so well. I could read music very well in those days. And I had perfect pitch. So I just kept pushing. And it culminated as a senior. I won an award that had never been given to anyone except a white male. And I hate to tell people the name of the award because it is just so ironic, The award was called the Aryan Award. Now, it wasn't AYR, it was ARIO, the Greek god of music. And so normally they would have this big program, and the press would be there, and they'd give the award to the student. And but there was a bomb threat, so they couldn't give me the award in public. So I still have the thing. I should walk around and wear it every now and then. The Aryan Award. But Martin Luther King was killed the year that we graduated. So that made a very, very strange ending to my high school career. Because I won the Aryan Award and was invited to sing the solo at Baccalaureate Sunday, that was the Sunday that happened before graduation, and it was the Sunday ceremony that happened after seniors were done with classes. So I had to get out there to practice. And I'd get there okay, and then I'd have to ride the school bus back home. So the person who had become my pianist, a white girl who was, Sue, I think her name was, offered to give me a ride home. What I didn't know was that her father didn't allow her to come to our neighborhood. And that was relevant because she was speeding to get me there and get home before her father found out. The second thing I didn't know was that people were still trying to hurt me. So a car ran us off the road, and we hit a pole. I didn't have on a safety belt, so I hit the front windshield and came through it and back out and tore all of this open. And then I hit the front dashboard and crushed my jaw. And then I hit the side window and further damaged this. And then hit the dashboard again and broke the jaw in 3 places over here. She got a scratch on her knee and a chipped tooth. Yeah, and a new car, by the way. Her father got her a new car. And I was unconscious for several days. So there was a lot about it I didn't remember for a long time. I didn't remember she was speeding, for example. I do remember seeing the car that ran us off the road. But it ended my music career. I had been offered a scholarship to Juilliard. I had been offered an academic music scholarship to Duquesne University. I was frightened to go to Juilliard. So I accepted the full ride at Duquesne, and didn't know it was Catholic. That's how naive we were in first generations going to college. I had relatives that went to college, but and my grandmother had a scholarship to Meharry, but she didn't take it. After she got sick, she decided that she didn't have the stamina to be a doctor. My mother also had a scholarship to some school, I'm not sure which, but she didn't take it. So I was really the first one in my immediate family to go to college. Everyone had graduated from high school, but not college. And so my mouth was wired shut. Imagine that. And I kept talking, which is kind of me. But it damaged my vocal cords so badly that my 4-octave range squeezed into 2 in the middle. And that's where race became an issue also. Because for a solid year, I was in the most advanced class of the music department at Duquesne University, but my voice teacher there accused the voice teacher that I'd had from I think I was 5.5 through high school, accused her of not teaching me proper technique, or else that's, and that was why my voice was going. But after the year was over, when I finally found out that there was something called an ear, nose, and throat specialist for singers, she didn't tell me that. So I finally found one, went there, and he said, you talked for 11 weeks with wires in your mouth. You damaged your vocal cords. And they should have told you to be on complete voice rest. And your voice teacher should have told you to be on complete voice rest rather than trying to change your technique. So there was not much you can do once you have damaged your vocal cords, especially back then. There was no operation that could repair them adequately for singing, for the kind of singing I was doing, Western classical music. And it could have left more scars. So I said, well, and I can't go on voice rest for a year. It wouldn't have helped by then. So I stopped taking all music classes. But all of that was kind of a result of racist behavior. Just amazing how far-reaching it can be,
So how did you handle that, like, academically?
Well, my scholarship was still full ride because it was academic and voice. So I just stopped taking all music classes because I couldn't. The music school was like you walk in at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning and you don't leave until 11. You're just there, just totally immersed in musical theory and various voice lessons. And, I was in music conservatory, so it was constant. And if you can't sing. So I stopped even walking in front of the music school. It would just make me cry. So I took all my academic classes, did very well. That next year, just took academic stuff. Tried to take Yoruba class, but they wouldn't let me, so I took Swahili instead. And did very well, and then decided I wasn't going to go back. So I didn't go back to Duquesne. It was too painful.
So after 2 years at Duquesne, what did you do?
I announced to my mother that May that I was not going back to school. And my mother said, as she often did when she wanted to press me to be as mature as possible, I'm sure you'll use your best judgment. And I think she thought that meant I was going to relent and go back, because she didn't put any pressure on me at all that whole summer. And we came to Cleveland to gather up more relatives to go to a family reunion. I can't remember where it was, maybe Illinois, I don't know. But we were in this, and I decided to stay in Cleveland. So when we came back from the family reunion, reversing our route back through Cleveland, I told Mom I was going to stay here, and I stayed with relatives for a couple of months. Was hired as an uncertified teacher / instructor at a really kind of novel school, and I've been here ever since. So that was 1970. Bought a house, did some things like that. Gave myself a house for my 21st birthday.
And so how was it different living had you traveled a lot when you lived in Lincoln Park?
We had traveled, yes. In those days, a lot of the travel was visiting relatives in various places. Um, and I know now that that was pretty customary for African Americans of certain economic classes. You know, it was easier to travel to see relatives and stay in their homes than it was to try to stay in hotels or what have you. So we didn't do very much hotels travel, kind of travel. But we had traveled around the country visiting relatives. Surprisingly, though, not to the South. Um, so the first year I was here, a cousin said he was going to Alabama because he went every year. He'd drive down. So I hopped in the car at the last minute and went to our little town. Now, I call it our little town because I heard so many stories about Athens, Alabama, that I knew where houses were. I mean, I could picture where they were. So when we got to Athens, I asked for a particular street. I got out of the car and I knocked on a door because I knew it was my cousin's house, a contemporary of my mother. And she opened the door. She didn't know I was coming. And she said, "Oh my God, you must be Pity's daughter." And I was embraced and dragged into the house, and neighbors were called and relatives were called from all over the city. And one guy had a little local radio show and he interviewed me. It was really weird. It was very strange. But it was beautiful too. And yeah, that was pretty special.
So you returned to Cleveland, and when did you meet your husband?
Well, let's see. I bought the house in 71. I moved in actually at the end of 70. Cleveland was a very strange town to me because, I grew up in a small town. So the noise was pretty intense. After living with I'm just going to say I lived in a house that had 8 children and no books. That was surprising enough for me to write all of my friends to tell them that I was in a house with 8 children and no books.
That's your cousin's house.
Yes, I didn't want to emphasize that, but it's true. Not a magazine, not a newspaper, not a book. Now, I just want to say, I told you my mother had arthritis, but we'd walk all the way to the library every Saturday that she could walk. And when she couldn't, I walked by myself to the Pittsburgh Public Library, which is a good 4 or 5 miles away, to get books. And I did that from the time I was 2 or 3 years old until I went to college. It's just, my life was books, And so to be in a house with that many children and no books, it just was flabbergasting. Where was I going with that?
You stayed there for
for just a couple of months, and then I decided to get an apartment. So big step for young Leslye, and I found this 4-suiter apartment on 105 in Superior, which was clean and it was pretty economical, and the neighbors seemed to be nice. I knocked on all the 3 other doors, and they were nice people. I introduced myself, moved in I think the end of September, and by November 1st, each of those 3 families had moved out, and new people had moved in. And they were crazy. And one particular night, I heard the child who lived in the apartment directly below me scream, "Don't shoot my mommy." And then I heard bang, 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 bang. So I was crouched on my bed, terrified, called my mother like at 3 in the morning, And I said, as soon as it's daylight, I'm getting out of here. So I called a cousin and we drove around looking for new places to rent. And I saw this little tiny house. It's still in Cleveland on Glendale. And it had a for sale sign. So I just called the number and I said, would you consider renting it? And a woman said she was ill. She was moving to Florida because she had Parkinson's and she just wanted to get rid of all her properties. And I could feel free to move in with a rent as an option to buy. And I said, really? She said, yeah, why not? And I said, but I don't have a down payment. She said, well, we'll use your rent as the down payment. So $150 a month was what the rent was. By that time, I'd saved up a little bit of money and bought a whole house full of furniture from a girl who was moving back with her parents for another $150, and I moved in. So when I met my husband, so I was 20. When I was 21, she signed the house over to me because she couldn't do it before I was 21. And and that's when I found out how heavy sexism was. Because when I was signing the papers, the person who had me sign them said, you know, if you were married, you couldn't do this. I said, couldn't do what? She said, you couldn't buy a house by yourself. I said, really? She said, yeah, your husband would have to be there and approve. I said, well, that makes sense. I mean, they're a couple, you know. I said, it would be the same for him, right? She said, no, he could buy it by himself. So that taught me something. But anyway, so I had a house. I was teaching, uncertified though I was. Decided to buy a car, a new car. I wanted a new car. Had never owned a car before. I had owned a car when I got my license. That's a whole other story. We want to talk about that, but that was before. Right after I moved into the house, I bought a used car, taught myself to drive it. I think the statute of limitations has run on driving without a license. I taught myself to drive it by driving it, and then got my license. But when I wanted to get a new car, I took a second job so that I wouldn't have to dip into the savings account that I had. And that's where I met my husband, the person who became my husband. And I was really not interested in men in any kind of deep way. But he had read the same book I was reading, and we had good conversations around those books, about books that I was reading. And it wasn't the stock phrase, hey mama, can I come with you? Or those things that people say on the street. So we went out to dinner a few times, and I wanted to have a baby because I think I naively thought I had a house, I had a car, I'm ready to have a child. So I asked him if he was interested in me having a baby, and he said, okay. So I let him move in with me, and then I was convinced by others that I should marry him because of the child, so I did.
So you had your child first and then you married him?
Well, I was pregnant, and I was content with that, actually, but I was given to believe that the child's rights to the properties and the connection with the father would be more substantial if I married him. So I told my family in Pittsburgh, okay, if you guys want to have a wedding, I'll come. So I did.
And how many children do you have?
I have 2 sons.
And only because I know you have a different partner now. How long did your relationship with him last?
My husband? Ooh, actually, I was fully committed to continuing that relationship, ethically, morally, but it just wasn't. It wasn't good. So when I realized that he was not as interested in supporting his family as I was in supporting my family, and more than that, very worried that I would not be loyal, to the point where it just didn't seem healthy. I asked him to leave, and that was about a year and a half into the marriage. Actually, it was maybe 2 years into the marriage, and by 1976, we were divorced.
So your current partner is a woman.
Yes.
Did you at any point identify as lesbian, or was your, I know for some people their sexuality is fluid and evolves over the course of their lifetime. Did you have any identification as being a lesbian while you were married or prior to being married, or was that like politically not an option for you?
Well, you're talking about many years ago. So, and you're also talking about my life growing up in a very small town. I never heard the word lesbian. Didn't know it existed. Knew what I felt about women, and watched. There was one fella in my neighborhood who was maybe my mother's contemporary, maybe a little bit younger, whose name was Georgia Boy. That's what they called him. And I heard people talk about his family sending him to New York. Some vague reference. When I was in college, there was a particular bar we would go to that now I recognize the bartender was a lesbian, and she would give me free drinks all the time. But I liked her, but I didn't know. When I was also at Duquesne University, I had a kind of special relationship with the Dean of Women, the resident advisor of our freshman dorm, and her lover, who was the resident advisor to the men's dorm, one of the men's dorms. But I still hadn't heard the word lesbian. I think when I married my husband, I was content to have whatever and I'd had some sexual interactions with girls, but I still didn't know the word. So, and I don't think I had any shame or political something about it. I do know that I understood that it was not something I was talking about, because nobody was talking about it. Of course, nobody was talking about sex, period. Although everybody was doing it. But when I married my husband, I had firmly committed to honoring that marriage till it ended. I mean, I was all in, regardless of what I was feeling. And the other part is, sexually, well, if you do it right, it doesn't matter who it is. Yeah, so there were other reasons why I separated from and then divorced him, not having to do with my sexual orientation. After I left him, I fell in love with a woman, and she was married. And that was traumatic because she was in love with me too. And but she packed up and moved away. So that kind of sent me in a tailspin for a while. But fortunately, the friends at my workplace who were very, very special to me, and they kept me in a good space before I was married. And then after I was married and I had to leave that job, some of them still were very, very close friends.
And this
Which
was
helped
at
a
the
lot.
school?
Yeah. So, in fact, they helped me buy my first car without a license. It was.
So, you're an attorney now, so obviously at some point you returned to school.
Mm-hmm.
When did
Well, I
that
returned
happen
to
for you?
school. I returned to school right after, not long after my divorce. I realized that the money I was making at school and the could not support my new budget as a mother, and I ended up, and the divorce took a long time because my ex refused to sign away his dower rights to the house. I don't know whether he naively thought that there was equity in it, but I hadn't had the house that long or what, but he just kept delaying and delaying and delaying till I ended up losing the house. I had subsumed all of his debt into my teacher's credit union account, so the debt was all mine. And it was in the same account as my car note. So I lost the car, I lost the house. That first year after I asked him to leave, I'd signed up for something called Section 8 and forgot all about it because they'd never contacted me. You know, a year went by and I was scheduled to be evicted, actually, from the house. And I think the eviction was going to happen like within a month. And I got this letter saying that I had been accepted into the Section 8 program. So I said to myself, whatever house I see that is acceptable, I'm not going to be picky. I'm not going to look at 3 or 4 different houses, because I think at that time I was already back in school. Decided that I wanted to have a degree in early childhood development education to support my work history, which was it was a K through 8 certification, and I'd been teaching 3rd grade. And I wanted a degree in psychology because it didn't make sense to me to have one without the other. So, as an aside, I just say that Cleveland State didn't have such a possibility. It was a fairly new school. I think it was started in '64, and this was just '76. So I signed up for both schools at once.
What, the other school?
The psych department, which was in arts and sciences, and the education department, which was the School of Education. So I signed up for both of them.
Both at Cleveland State?
Uh-huh. And designed my own. And so, which later actually came full circle, and I found myself in law school because of that. But they didn't have majors and minors, and they didn't have double majors. They didn't have any of that at the time. I think they probably do now. So I actually graduated twice. In 1979, got 2 degrees, By that time, I had my second son, and my last semester as an undergrad, I had I was pregnant, and one of my very good friends from the school where I worked lived with me, and I surprisingly had a C-section. So, but my my water broke in my statistics midterm, and I finished the midterm, and actually got a low A. The other students said it wasn't fair because they were traumatized by my water break. It became a kind of standing joke in my class. But he was a C-section baby, and which made it a little more difficult. Fortunately, we had planned it so that all my classes were on one floor, and I could take the elevator up to get to them. So I took a week off and went back to school, finished my year. And I had to do it that way because I had already accepted a fellowship, one of the last NIMH fellowships, to the psych department. And it was scheduled to begin that fall. And so if I didn't finish, I wouldn't have been able to accept it. So I took a week off, went back to school, and finished my senior year, and started graduate school in that fall in the psych department.
So your second son, your first son, you had intentionally gotten pregnant. Was your second son an intentional pregnancy as well?
You could say yes. It was an intentional birth.
Absolutely. And so at this point, you were living in Cleveland. What part of Cleveland are you in?
At which point?
Like while you're going to your undergraduate.
Undergrad, I was living in Cleveland part of the time, and then in Cleveland Heights.
Okay, so I guess where were your children going to school?
My older son's first school was in Shaker. And, well, is that true? That's sort of true. I mean, his kindergarten was at, and we chuckle about this, his kindergarten was at Rainey, no, excuse me. What's the name of the school? His kindergarten was a Jewish school. And so his first actual foreign language was Hebrew. And the reason we kind of chuckle about it is because my younger son's now wife was also in the same kindergarten class, not in the same class, but in the same kindergarten grade at the same time as he. So they could have met then. And it's kind of funny. But then Daudi's first year was in first grade on was in Shaker Heights. Then after I met Mary, she was living in East Cleveland and I was living in Shaker Heights, and we were trying to figure out how to put our households together in a house big enough for us, because I need a lot of space. And we looked and looked and looked. We even looked at a house that was owned by one of my former professors. He was moving to Minnesota. And we just couldn't find anything that was as structurally big as her house in East Cleveland. So I reluctantly decided to move to East Cleveland. What I didn't tell you was that the cousins who I lived with initially when I moved to Ohio lived in East Cleveland. They lived on Delmont, and at the time Delmont was a very beautiful street. That was in 1970. It was still quite a nice street. Now it's not. I drive down and I can't even tell which house it was that he lived in. Maybe it's not even there anymore. I don't know.
And what year did you meet Mary?
1983.
So from having watched her film, I understand that being involved with a woman was relatively new for her at that point.
It was not new for me.
Okay. So I feel like I would like to hear about kind of you have all of these very interesting intersections where you're a single mother, you're an African American, you're a woman, you're at least involved with women romantically. I don't know how you identified at that point. So it seems to me that there would be a lot of pressure on you because you're not conforming to kind of the white middle class heteronormative standards. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's interesting because when I went back to school in 1976, I was told by an African American young man that I was taking a spot that rightfully belonged to black men just by being in school. That's the only I guess there could have been some other overt statements made to me about various other things. I mean, stated from a person to me. But I don't remember any. I did get punched in the face in 1989 by a teenage white boy who I did not know, had never met, had never spoken to, in Cleveland. So I guess that's a certain kind of speech, isn't it? And I will briefly tell you about it. I was going to Value City on 222nd, East 222nd Street to get thread because they sold it in bulk and it was real cheap. And I was sort of just fantasizing, actually, because music was playing. It was a Sunday morning. It was beautiful outside. And they were doing a retrospective of James Cleveland. So James Cleveland's music was playing, and in between, I was sort of fussing at him for having hit his wife. So it was both those things going on in my head at the same time. So I was kind of oblivious. Got to the store, parked the car, jumped out, and the door was locked. And I was standing there for a couple of seconds trying to figure out why the door was closed, when I heard, "You dumb nigger, don't you know it's Easter and the store is closed?" And I turned around and I saw these 5 white teenagers coming toward me. So I jumped in my car and didn't say a word to them, rolled up the back windows, which were crank wind up. That's why I have automatic now. I rolled up the back window on the passenger side and the passenger side window, got the back window closed on the driver's side, and just as I was cranking my window up, he reached in and punched me in the eye. And they all laughed. And something happened in me that I never want to have happen again. I forgot they were human. It was like when a mosquito gets you and you just want to smash it. I started my car and I went after this kid. And we went around the back of the store, and there were boxes, and he was climbing over the boxes, trying not to get hit by the car, and the other friends had scattered, and he was screaming, "Call the police," and I could hear it, but I really was not in my right mind. I just was out there somewhere else. And he ran across the street, and I followed him in the car. And he got to a door of a restaurant that was open. I think it was a restaurant. and he ran inside, and I sat there and waited for him. I mean, that's crazy. And then until I thought to myself, if the police do come, they're not going to understand that he hit you. So you need to leave because they don't care. And it was all of that in my head. So I pulled the car out and went on the freeway, and I drove maybe 2 exits. And I pulled over and I started to weep for that young fella. I mean, he had to be 1989. He had to be like 15 or 16. That was my older son's age. And I thought, what kind of life must he be leading? What kind of parents must he have to have given him sufficient amount of hate for a person he doesn't know, who is his mother's age? And the boldness that it would take to reach into someone's car and punch them. And I cried because I had forgotten he was a kid. So, and then I sat there and I tried to figure out, how am I going to tell my children what happened to me? Because I don't want them to be infected by this. And so I sat there and I just cried and cried and cried. And then I called Mary. I think I stopped at another store to try to find some thread. My head was in a scramble. She didn't answer. I went on home and sat them down and told them what happened. And of course, they didn't have the same kind of sadness for the kid that I had. But they didn't have the huge amount of anger and hate that I was afraid they might develop over time. So that was in 1989. So we're talking about 76, where someone's telling me I shouldn't be in school because I'm a woman, to 89, when someone's hitting me because they want to call me the N-word and they just want to hit me. As a lesbian, I'm sure people have said things behind my back. I had one elementary school teacher who had the whole school had embraced us as co-parents, as a couple. We've had some wonderful experiences where we overheard a mother telling her son, who asked which one is Khalil's real mother, and she said Khalil was blessed with 2 mothers, and that felt wonderful. But we had an elementary school teacher who, knowing all of that, I said the word lesbian in a parent-teacher meeting, and she dropped all of her papers just because I said the word. But, on the other hand, my grandmother, when we went to church with her, introduced Mary as her granddaughter-in-law, and that was before we were even able to get married. And the church said, well, if it's okay with Mama, it's okay with us, So I know that I've been discriminated against. Words were never spoken to me directly. I know that I've been given a tough time because I'm out and I feel proud of who I am. I feel proud of our family. I think we've done a marvelous thing, not only for ourselves, but for the community as a whole. Anytime you rear 2 sons to be the marvelous creatures that they are, who are able to be strong and not be violent, to be caring, and to share their lives with other people effectively, then I think you've contributed to the whole society. So if people can't adjust to that, I feel sad for them.
Great. That was the first question.
And maybe several others at the same time, right?
I think we've been weaving in and out. I think because we both know the question so well that it was inevitable.
Yeah.
So, can you think back to your earliest memories of East Cleveland and tell me what life was like then?
When I first came to East Cleveland, as I said, it was sort of, I landed here. People said, well, why did you move to Cleveland? And I would say, well, I just left Pittsburgh. Living with my cousins, there was a gay young fella they were all younger than me. All the children in the family were younger than me. But he was clearly a unique creature. Fantastic dancer, just the most marvelous dancer you could ever find. I was hoping I'd see him. If you ever saw the old movie Fame, he was that kind of dancer, the fella in the movie. And but they teased him a lot, and he seemed to be oblivious to their teasing. He was pretty effeminate. But the community as a whole, I only stayed there about a month and a half. I told you how I felt about not having any books in the house. I don't know what the other houses were like. I don't think I knew that it was a separate city when I first moved there. When I got the apartment, which was in the city of Cleveland, people warned me that it was a dangerous area, but it looked pretty to me. I mean, I grew up in a small town, so if you can walk by, if you can go into a museum that's within walking distance of where you live, that's a great place as far as I was concerned. And I did that often. So I really didn't know East Cleveland to be its own separate city. By the time we were discussing whether to combine our families in one city or another, I knew that East Cleveland schools was something to be concerned about. Of course, I thought that Cleveland schools were something to be concerned about when I first moved to Cleveland. One of the things I did when I was still an uncertified teacher was to help create the first course of study for social studies. And that seemed very far behind what was happening in Pennsylvania at the time. So I was oblivious to East Cleveland, to tell you the truth. In '83, when I moved, as I said, the school system I was not super happy about. But we figured if we didn't like it, we could put them in private school. And we did that from time to time. They were in private school. But the elementary school that our sons attended in the early days, Focus Scope, which was separately set in St. Philomena Church or something, I thought was really fine. And I particularly was happy to see how much parent involvement there was. Our PTA meetings were packed with people. And in the gifted classes, we even had meetings of family members in addition to the PTA meetings. Mary and I were fully involved in activities in the school if the kids were going someplace, or if there were activities that they needed parent support, we were there all the time. So, but the various administrations have never seemed to be real high on ethics.
Talking about the government administration?
Yes, the government. And I didn't know quite so much about the school administration per se, but I knew that when 7th grade happened, my younger son was not going to be going to Kirk Middle School. I knew that. And I knew that I didn't want my older son to be there either.
Did they go to Shaw?
Daoud went for 1 year. And actually, Shaw was better than Kirk Middle School. When Daoud went to 7th grade, they both were attending a private school, and some papers or something had been sent to Kirk by mistake. So I dropped him off at the private school, and I went to Kirk to pick up the papers. First day of school. When I walked in with Daoud at his new school, the kids were all sitting around, lounging, talking to each other. Their bagels and croissants or stuff were there for them to munch on, and they were just talking about their summer and just relaxing before school started. I got down to Kirk, and they had the children lined up like they were prisoners. They weren't allowed to talk to each other. First day of school, back in school, they weren't allowed to talk to each other. And if they were suspended. And the hallway was kind of dark. They were literally lined up throughout the entire hallway, just one person. And I thought, I was right. Better to pay a little money and find another space for them. Because for me, discipline doesn't mean that. So, did I answer?
So kind of in your earliest memories, when you recognized that East Cleveland was its own city, probably when Mary was living there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to assume that you visited Mary in East Cleveland?
Yes, I
before
did.
You moved there? Like, what were your impressions, especially because I wanted on tape that your partner identifies as white?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so she was in an interesting position because white flight had already happened by 1983.
And she had lived in some part of East Cleveland since, I think, 69. Mm-hmm. So our street, Page, there's Upper Page and there's Lower Page. And Lower Page had already established some kind of bad reputation. It's north of Euclid. It was, I think, although I've never been down the street, it, I think, had a lot of apartment buildings, and there were some nefarious activities going on down there. Upper Page, where we live, which is south of Euclid and very short street between Terrace and Euclid, had several white families or white houses with white owners. One of the oldest people on the street was a former teacher who lived just a few doors down from us. And as a matter of fact, I think my older son got his first puppy from her. But there was a gay couple, male, that lived down the street from us. They must have moved. He must have moved when we left East Cleveland, because I don't see him there now. In Focus Scope Elementary School, there were several biracial children. My younger son is biracial. And so from the other tape that Mary did, that she was completely closeted when I met her. And so we moved in from Shaker and decided, I think that next spring, to paint the house. And we painted it bright purple and lavender and hung a rainbow flag outside. And the only comments I heard about that was from a neighbor who said, "It's different, but it's pretty." So
you were the lavender menace.
So the sky didn't fall. In Mary's relationships with people that she had known for years, mostly African American and African, and there were lots of shifts that happened. She had been a foster parent to several children who, for the most part, were adults and even had children, and they didn't know she was a lesbian. So that was a process, and she was very, very strong in it and explained that, this is her family and she loves us. So if they couldn't hang, that she'd see them later. Many of them hung around and stayed, and some didn't. But, being yourself is not for the weak.
Okay, so let's circle back to East Cleveland and your earliest memories.
Mm-hmm.
Your particular street sounds like it was pretty diverse.
Are you talking about Page now?
Yes, Upper Page.
Yes.
Did you have a lot of interaction with other areas in the city? I know that in other conversations you've talked about how East Cleveland is kind of like a bedroom community for you, that a lot of your work is outside of East Cleveland. How would you characterize your other interactions in the city? Early interactions.
Early. Aside from the library, virtually none. They didn't have a supermarket that I felt comfortable shopping in. Mary has increased my consciousness about trying to buy at least gasoline or something in the city. So we try to do that. We did have one place, and I thank you for helping me to remember this, one place where we used to go that was quite pleasurable, and that was the donut shop. You can see it now. It's across from the Walgreens drugstore. But it used to be a very vibrant place filled with what I would call crusty old black guys. And they just had the most marvelous conversations. And Mary and I were usually the only two women in the place besides the folks that worked on, that served us. And we'd go in and we'd play Ms. Pack and listen to, mostly I wanted to just listen to them. Because to tell you the truth, that was the closest sound I could hear that harkened back to my early days in Lincoln Park. A lot of them were Southern guys. They always had an opinion about something. Great conversation and a great wealth of knowledge and wisdom. So we had lots of fun there. But other than that, it seemed like everything we started to use left. For example, the well, I thought it was a YWCA, but I guess it was a YMCA. I was on the board of the Imani African American Dance Company, and we started rehearsing and having classes in that Y. And there was a swimming pool there. And they closed the swimming pool, and then they sold the Y to a church, and so that possibility was gone. There's no when Daoudi wanted to be on the swim team. He was at the high school 1 year, I told you, and he wanted to be on the swim team. They had to take the swim team down to Cleveland State because they closed the swimming pool at Shaw High School. It just was disappointing. So, if you have contacts in other areas, you just use those instead, and that's what we did. That's what we do. Let's see, where else? I can't think of any place else we would go. We used a mechanic for a while. Until he stiffed us, and then stopped using it there.
So you said except for the library, you didn't have a lot of contacts. What was your relationship with the library?
Well, I used the library a lot. It was not easy always to get books that I wanted, but I stopped using it because I found it easier to just use the county library or to use Shaker Library, the library in Cleveland Heights, not Shaker, or the Cleveland Public Library. Years later, when I tried to get a room to use there, because one organization that I'm on the board of constantly met at Cleveland Heights Library, and I thought, well, why can't we meet in East Cleveland's library? And it was so hard just getting a room for 7 people to meet that I said, I'm never doing this again. So I stopped.
Okay. So what are your fondest memories of East Cleveland?
My absolute fondest memory of East Cleveland is when City Council passed our human rights ordinance, and it was a delightful City Council meeting. They haven't always been in agreement or on the same page with each other for various votes, but this time it was notably unanimous, even though one of the City Council members couldn't be there that evening. She sent messages that made it very clear that she was definitely on board with it and would have voted yes had she been able to be there. So that was a beautiful moment.
Can you explain a little bit what the Human Rights Ordinance is?
I certainly can. It is, as you know, throughout the state of Ohio, there are no protections for LGBT people, for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people. There's no statewide law that would protect them from undue discrimination, which means that the discrimination isn't illegal. So when an organization that I'm affiliated with started endorsing candidates, we asked those candidates in East Cleveland, we asked them if they would be willing to support a human rights ordinance that would provide protections in employment, housing, and public accommodations that would be inclusive of LGBT people. And they said absolutely. So we took them at their word, and we helped develop an ordinance that said it was similar to what the Ohio Civil Rights Commission has and would like to have, that includes LGBT people, but they're not so far allowed to do that, or what EEOC has around employment. And so we developed this what now East Cleveland calls the Human Rights Act of 2011. We shared it with City Council to see if they would approve of it, and they said yes. And it says that you can't discriminate against people who want to rent an apartment just because you think they might be lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender. As long as they're behaving appropriately as tenants, you can't refuse them housing, you can't refuse them employment, you can't fire them because they're LGBT, and you can't refuse to serve them at the counter, like used to happen for black people. They would be refused at the eating counter, at a restaurant or whatever, or hotel spaces didn't accept blacks either. And you can't do that to LGBT people. You just have to be fair and treat people with respect. So there's a commission connected to that Human Rights Act, that has about 5 to 7 people, according to the law, that would hear complaints that are filed against offenders, alleged offenders. And they would try to resolve the problem, either by mediation, or if they can't mediate the problem, then they would try to investigate it to see if there's legitimacy there. And if so, they try to conciliate, after the fact. Or it gives a private cause of action to the complainant to go out and file a discrimination suit. So that's a remarkable ordinance, and East Cleveland should be very proud of it. And in fact, other cities around the state are looking at it as a model. It was passed by City Council in 2011, July 19th, as a matter of fact. And so, of course, it became law soon after, because of the passage. Upon passage, it became law. Unfortunately, our mayor either inadvertently forgot to sign it or whatever, but he said he was signing it. But I've noted that it's not been signed. But regardless, it's still law. And we are very, very pleased that we've had verbal support from the mayor. We've had support from all of the council members. And in fact, they were given awards because of the passing of this bill into law. So that was my very best day in East Cleveland. I think there have been some other days too. One day in particular when we had a community picnic, and I just interviewed people just to find out how they felt about stuff on camera. It wasn't a part of any program or project. It was just my own curiosity. I've had some pleasant walks in the park, both with my puppy and Mary, and without the puppy. My grandchildren who come here from Chicago are very impressed that there's, quote, ample parking, unquote. And Mary and them have had some really fine times doing deer hunting with a camera throughout the city of East Cleveland. Another thing that I'm very proud of, Mary, my spouse, is the president of Windermere Renaissance. She just became president last year, but several years back, when we first moved back to East Cleveland, because we left for a while, we moved in 90 and we came back in 2005. And by that time, our street had most of the people who lived there when we were there before still live there, so that was good. But down toward Euclid Avenue, there are 3 apartment buildings. One is extremely well kept. The other is dicey, and the third one is an abandoned building. Beyond that, on Euclid Avenue itself was a huge building that had been a small strip mall, maybe with 4 stores or something like that in a row. And the stores were all closed. I'm sorry, I keep having these little memories of pleasant things. And one of the stores that was in that strip mall used to sell African statues or African-esque statues. And when we first moved to East Cleveland back in '83, for my birthday, my younger son bought this huge rhinoceros that probably weighs 20 pounds, maybe a little more. And He bought it. He paid for it with his allowance overtime, and for my birthday, he brought it home. I knew nothing about it, and he carried it all the way up the street. So that was a fond memory that came there at that moment. But when we moved back to East Cleveland in 2005, that whole strip mall was dead. And the building had turned into a place where prostitutes did their business and drug sales were happening. And there were all kinds of gang signs on it, but mostly, even more than the gang signs, were tributes to people who had been killed. Many of them had been killed in East Cleveland. Some had been killed in the city of Cleveland, and as far away as Toledo and Cincinnati, people had put memorials to folks that had been killed, had died violently. And there was a group of people who wanted to keep that building as the memorial, and there were other people who thought it should be torn down. Well, I was in the latter group of people who thought it should be torn down, because I thought that if you wanted to memorialize people who had been killed violently, the best thing to do is to collect all the guns and stop being violent. The second reason why I wanted it to be torn down is because if we were trying to rebuild East Cleveland, I didn't see any way possible that a person who had a young family who wanted to, and that's how you build a city. You have starter families move in, and they have young children, they like the school, they move in, and they support the town because, you know, it has added value for them as a family. And I couldn't imagine being a parent of young children wanting to move to a city whose grand memorial had to do with how many people were killed there. So I didn't think it was good for the city, and I didn't think it was good as a memorial. So the city, I can't remember, I think the city tore the building down, but it just left a blight there. So trash and garbage was piling up there. And also in front of the apartment building that was abandoned, there was at least a 6.5 foot high, maybe 4 feet deep pile of garbage and trash and all kinds of stuff in front of that building. So much so you couldn't use the sidewalk there. And, you know, every night I'd come home late from work and I'd drive around the corner and the people would scatter, and, you know, and I'd worry that some child was going to be dragged into that abandoned building or behind the garbage, and who knows what you'd find there. So finally, one day, Mary and I decided to take pictures of the place, of the pile of garbage. And we took pictures of it and decided that we were going to go down and clean it up. And what we did with the pictures was we put a note on it that said, on a day certain, we named the day, the 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, we were going to go down and we were going to help clean this up. And if anyone on the street wanted to come and help us, we'd be happy to have their support. And then we stuck those pictures with the note in everybody's front door. And there were lots of people who told Mary, for example, nobody's going to come down there and help clean up that mess. It's horrible. It's horrible. And so well, we're going to go down there. We'll be there. And so my part, I didn't talk to a lot of the neighbors, but I did go in to the church that's across the street from this mound of stuff, because I saw that their hedges had been cut and their hedges were also piled on top of all this garbage and trash. So I said, well, I'll go and talk to the minister, and maybe they'll have a work Sunday and they'll come, you know, and not dressed in church clothes, but come and clean up, and that'll be part of their service. I thought, I mean, it sounds like a good idea to me. Of course, I'm not a preacher, but I went down and I sat through his sermon, which I found to be very sexist. It was on Mother's Day, and well, I digress. But So I talked with him after the service because it was going to happen 2 weeks after that, and I wanted to give him time to talk to his parishioners. And he said, "No, that's the city's job to clean up. We're not going to do that." So he didn't. But all the other neighbors, even the folks who lived in the questionable middle apartment building that some say sold, drugs were being sold out of there, they all came. Even a woman who couldn't really walk came and held bags, is sitting in a chair, came and held bags for us to fill with the stuff. And we cleaned it up, and it's still not great because the building is still there. Building hasn't been torn down, but it's never gotten to that height again. And people, I see people sort of, helping to keep it at least tolerable. The other thing that happened, though, was a result of us really wanting to transplant some of our trees from our backyard. We didn't want to cut them down exactly, but the new trees that were growing just naturally, Mary tried to plant in the space where on Euclid, where the strip mall had been. But there was just so much clay, nothing would grow there. So she kept trying to transplant these trees, and finally she became a member of Windermere Renaissance, and they took on as a project to get a backhoe and dig up the soil, and the city allowed, I think it was Mayor Brewer who said yes initially, and then Mayor Norton continued that permission to plant flowers, to make a garden out of that space. And I think the space is like 140 feet by 70. It's a huge space. And the Windermere Renaissance people came. Dr. Caius volunteered to run the backhoe and dug it up. This is before Huron Road Hospital left. And he was working there. So they started planting flowers, and Mary involved the children on the street on Page Avenue. So she went to each family that had children and asked them if they would be interested in having their kids come down and help make this garden happen. And the youngest child, I think, was only 3 at the time. Now he's in 2nd grade, and he's still very, very much involved, wants to go down to the garden all the time. And that happened on its own without any financial support from anybody except volunteers who donated. One of the most cynical neighbors, who said no one's ever going to help down there, has given these beautiful tapioca plants from his native land, and every year they have to be planted and then dug up in the winter and put away and then brought back. So Mary does the digging up and bringing back and all that stuff. But he donated those, and they're quite beautiful. The children, that evolved into a grant that Mary got for the children. So after 3 or 4 years, she noticed that, at school time, parents were really struggling for money, for resources to get the kids back in school. So she asked Community Connections? Neighborhood Connections. She asked Neighborhood Connections to donate $900 to give to the children, $100 each, so that they could buy school supplies. And I kind of helped with it a little bit by setting some boundaries, some rules for the kids' participation. They had to research some of the plants that they planted. They had to take pictures of them. They had to water them. They had to write in a journal and keep a journal. And I really wanted to see that blossom into something that would connect solidly with the library, but it didn't. So, but the children still participate. This year, Mary did not ask for another grant. I think she got the grant 3 years in a row or something like that, 2 years. But she didn't ask for a grant this year, and the kids still kept coming. It would be nice to see that as a project for the science department in their various schools and the library.
So, in anticipation of my next question, we've been talking about the ways that the city's changed over time. And I think for you and Mary, it might have been particularly noticeable since you left in 1990 and then returned in 2004. What do you think contributed to those changes?
Entropy. If you don't fix something, if you let tiny discord, tiny ethical missteps sit, they get bigger. When we moved back, we had decided when we left that we really wanted to move back. We love the old house. The house is over 100 years old. We love it. And we just decided we were going to move back. So that was delayed somewhat because my mother got sick and lived with us for 7 years, and her mother was sick and lived with us for 4 years. But bottom line is we had committed to move back, so we were going to do that. But after I moved in, I cried for 3 months. It was horrifying to me to see. I mean, there were crackheads everywhere. I'd never seen a crackhead till we were there at the house doing some rehab before we moved in, and I stopped to buy some junk food and noticed that there was this thick glass between me and the store salesperson. And I said, well, that's nice. You're protected. What about me? And just then, a guy walked in who was clearly high, and I got so scared I dropped everything and ran out to my car and drove off. So it took some reacclimating. And as I said, as I drive around the corner at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, if I stayed late at my office and I'd come home, people were actually scattering. I mean, the activity, the drug activity, the prostitution activity was so horrid at that corner of Euclid Avenue that it was just really blatant. One of the things that I can say is that when Mayor Brewer took charge of the city, that stuff began to leave. And I was very happy to see that happen. I mean, somebody had to do that. The police have always been very responsive. I've said I've used police officers in my work in other parts of Greater Cleveland, in Cleveland, for example, and it took me 5 hours to get a police officer to the scene. But in East Cleveland, they respond very quickly. Mm-hmm.
So what do you think led to those changes, though? I mean, obviously the introduction of crack, but are there larger structural reasons that?
Yes, I think that for the most part, the people who have governed our city have thought of themselves before the city. And in a larger town, you can absorb some of that and still get a lot of good things going on. But in a town the size of East Cleveland, I mean, it's only 3.5 square miles. You can't absorb that. Everyone has to have the clearest motives. They have to have a sense of commitment to the higher good of the whole city, not just to themselves or the people they like. And to the degree that doesn't happen, I'll give you an example. I was accepted as a board member to complete the term of a person who had resigned from the library board. And the library board terms are 7 years. There were only 6 months left of his tenure. And East Cleveland had screamed about, East Cleveland citizens had rejected the idea of joining the library or merging the library into a county system. They had rightfully protested the closing of the post office. That's a service that we deserve in our city. They had, too late and too little, protested the private action of Cleveland Clinic to remove Huron Road Hospital. And that was a losing cause, but I was glad to see people, and I participated in that. I helped to state our desire to keep the hospital because it was good for the city. But I thought the idea of not merging the library with the county system was misguided, mainly because I've used county systems. I used the county library in Beechwood when we lived there, and it was fantastic. It was clearly representative of the people of Beechwood. So it hadn't lost its identity as a Beechwood library because it was part of the county system, which is, by the way, inclusive of the 10% or more population of Black people who live in Beechwood. We had Kwanzaa celebrations every year. Anything we wanted to do in there was very open to our participation and design. The books were far more, the books on the shelves were far more inclusive than actually what I find in the East Cleveland Library. And so people just simply hadn't looked to see what a county library looked like. They hadn't seen it. But they thought of it as having a library taken away from East Cleveland. I didn't. But I was willing to hear what was talked about, and I suggested that they forego making a decision until it had been fully explored. Well, they fully explored it, decided to reject the merger idea, and so then I said to myself, well, maybe I'll get on the board to make sure that the library is in the best interest, is moving in the best interest of the children, because by that time I realized that East Cleveland Library's mandate was to supplement the school's library, which were the schools plural, libraries plural, some of which don't even exist. There are some schools in East Cleveland that don't have libraries at all, or at least at that time. So I knew that its mandate was as a supplement to the school's libraries, not for the pleasure and pure pleasure and entertainment of its adult citizens, is what I'm getting to. So I got on the board, and the first thing that I was asked to actually vote on after, well, the second thing I was asked to vote on was a trip by the board to go to Anaheim, I think it was Anaheim, California, for a week to a National Library Board meeting. And I thought national meetings are good. They help you learn things. But I was looking around the room, and the carpet needed to be cleaned, and we only had one security guard on during the day and one in the evening and none at night. And we already had reports that things had been stolen from the I think it was speakers that had been stolen from the new auditorium, and I thought $20,000 was the cost of the trip alone, and each board member was to get $95 per day for this trip that I thought might be good after this brand new library board got itself organized, maybe in a couple of years, but not in 3 months. So I ended up voting against it, along with actually a majority of the board members, but not the leadership of the board, just 4 board members. The leadership thought it was important to go. And when I asked, well, what about the budget? Because they wouldn't even tell me what it cost initially. They said, oh, we've got enough money to do that. And if we don't, we can move money from other areas. I said, no, I don't think so. So I asked for a specific budget. That's when I heard that it would be $20,000 to go, which, by the way, was the amount that was listed as the entire budget for the entire year of travel everywhere for anybody, plus the $95 per diem per 7 people. So the president, the secretary, and the treasurer, the president, the secretary, and the vice president, were all happy to go. But 4 people voted not to. And I was pleased that the majority voted as I saw it, as a way that would be most helpful to the people of East Cleveland. Needless to say, I did not get renewed as a board member when my 6 months were over. And the other 3 people who had voted to protect the resources of the East Cleveland, that's how I see it, protect the resources of the library for East Clevelanders, resigned because they knew that it just wasn't gonna be easy. Well, it wasn't gonna be possible to make any changes happen. So you asking me why I thought it changed? That's an example of why it changes. When personal gain, a trip to Anaheim, California, is valued more highly than protecting the resources of the library that already we had lost 2 other libraries, and that's why.
Okay, I'm going to pause here. All right,
Okay.
Welcome back. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. And this is some stuff that we've discussed earlier, but I'd like you to think about this specifically. How has race or racism impacted you personally?
Well, I'll take racism first. It has challenged me. It's worked very purposefully to increase my resolve to succeed. I appreciate that. It's probably closed some doors for me, some that I didn't even see. Or maybe, better stated, it created walls that I had no doors to. After describing my first encounter with the outside world as one where Emmett Till's face is on the cover of Jet magazine and his body laid out in the body of the magazine, you can see that it was an early encounter. And a continuous one, periodic encounter with the negatives associated with racism. Of course, on the other hand, racism is the reason why my mother was able to go to that special school where certainly segregation was the reason, and that is a part and parcel of racism as well, where she was able to And we have copies of the signatures of Du Bois and, all the great African-American philosophers that came to the school to speak because that's where they could speak. Let's see, racism. Racism provided a context for community in a certain sense because while we all know that each of us are individuals and very diverse from each other individual, the notion of criticizing unduly or clumping people into one group for the purpose of defining their humanity has actually created a sense of community among African Americans, among Black people, that might not have been quite so well maintained, but for the common enemy of racism.
Do you think that...
Well, I'm not done yet, because race is the other part of your question.
I wanted to ask about that
Okay,
specifically.
go on.
Do you think that the current rhetoric around post-racialism, or that we've somehow moved beyond racism, is in fact a ploy by the white supremacist heteropatriarchy to dismantle those ties?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's also sometimes those ties get to be too tight. Mm-hmm. So you define person who, I remember in the 70s where there were some folks, and I changed my name to Kutsana in those days. I was dashiki and buba and lapa and gele wearing, Kutsana at Duquesne University. Nobody called me Leslye at Duquesne, and yet I was not one to pour water on people's heads because they were straightened because the hair was straightened. So sometimes those constraints, the identity politics, get to be oppressive to the in-group. So I think it's primarily the folks that want it to be over so that they don't have to feel responsible for their own racism. But it also may be some people responding to the very tight grip that the expectation of unity where there's diversity instead, can feel a little constraining for folks. I tell the story that happened in East Cleveland, so I guess it's germane, of a group that I held of African American lesbians who I formed this group to sit and read books written by Black lesbians so that we could also talk about our lives ourselves. And when the group came together solidly, they decided they wanted to meet at our house every time. I guess it was comfortable, and I wanted actually them to meet in everyone's house, just travel around and meet each month at a different person's house. But they wanted to meet at my house. They wanted to stay there. So we did for 2 years. And one of our meetings 2 years into our group, they had a conversation about how Black women who date white women are sellouts in my house Mary's my partner. We weren't married then because we couldn't be, but long-term relationship. And they felt comfortable enough to have that conversation in my house. So I guess what I'm saying about that is those things that need to be discussed. I just kind of sat back and let everybody talk. It seemed a little odd, but they did. Race, though, for me has always been just a part of the wonderful wildflower-ness of humans. And I remember feeling as intrigued by the sound of African Americans who came from the South, particularly the woman who lived next door to me, who had been born into slavery. And the Southern sounds and the regionalism, the distinctions in vocabulary and accent. When I'd go into the Nino Superette in my neighborhood, and to buy fresh ground coffee for my mother, and Nino would pop a coffee bean in my mouth and speak to me in Italian. To me that was just as beautiful as hearing djembe drums play, or congas in the early days, because we didn't play djembe then. So all of that was pretty to me, and I knew gypsies. Gypsies lived in the woods in our neighborhood, and so did Native Americans. And my grandmother visited all those folks, so I visited all those folks because I went with her everywhere she went. So the distinctions that we call race, whatever the word means currently, I saw as just the beautiful array of differences that we have, the differences in foods, the aromas, in the houses. That to me is joyful. So, but racism, where one category of people or society defines one group as inferior or superior to another, is pretty sick, and it harms everybody. In the old days, when there weren't that many black people who were seen as serial killers, my mother would say, no wonder they're killing folks. They found out that they're supposed to be superior, but they're not. They're just ordinary. And they don't know what to do about it. So they're mad, And to teach a child that they're superior to a whole nation filled with other people is really one of the cruelest jokes you can play on somebody. And, it's to me, it's just as cruel. It doesn't look as cruel, on its face, as the struggles that black people have gone through historically, but it is as cruel, and it creates a society like we have today, which has its mammoth problems, including some of the problems that we find in East Cleveland.
So, how has race or racism impacted the city of East Cleveland?
Well, I can only go by hearsay. I know that there were people who felt superior because they were able to move into East Cleveland. I'm talking about black people now. And they probably only felt that because the white people who lived in East Cleveland felt they were superior to the colored folks that didn't move in. So racism certainly is a factor there. I'm not sure that the white flight that we saw in East Cleveland was totally around racism. I suspect that poor governance was happening before East Cleveland became the chocolate city of Ohio. But I can't prove that. I suspect that there were people who understood that the infrastructure, the water system, the sewage system, and all of that was old, and because East Cleveland is one of the oldest suburbs, I'm sure they knew that was falling apart. On a larger scale, we saw the effects of racism and how it made union strength less strong, allowed for companies to pack up and move to other parts of the country and then out of the country at a time when all urban areas needed to have those companies stay loyal to the communities. So the nearsightedness maybe of union work, because it's spotty on its reaction to race and racism, which made it weaker, if that makes sense. As I said, I was looking at East Cleveland through other people's eyes for the most part. I think racism, ironically, has a tendency to make the so-called inferior group, the African American group, suspicious of any assist or support or involvement of non-minorities. You know, we refer to East Cleveland as a black city, but it's not exclusively black. And somehow we have a tendency to forget that. Even in some of our public discourse, we talk about it as though we're only talking about black people, when our citizens come in a lot of different colors and stripes. So that to me is a part of what racism does too. It makes everything black or white and nothing in between. One of the observations my younger son had, and our family discussed a lot when we were trying to rear our children as peaceful warriors, both as it related to being lesbian and also being a biracial family. Our sons decided that you can be biracial and be black because, number one, almost all black people in the United States are biracial. And you know, if you walk full circle, since everybody came from Africa, everyone's from Africa anyway. And at the same time, realizing the sad position of a child who's biracial when their mother is white and their father's black, since so much of our culture is distributed and remembered and taught by the women in the families. You have a child who doesn't necessarily know anything about either culture if the mother is unable to communicate that in a realistic way. So you know, my son is biracial and black, and my other son is black and probably biracial just because he was born in the United States of parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents who were subjected to enslavement and ownership.
Do you feel like the fact that East Cleveland is a predominantly African American community has impacted its relationship with Cleveland as a larger community, or like the state of Ohio or the county? Because it is, I mean, Cleveland, the city of Cleveland is more diverse than the surrounding suburbs, but is still not as high a percentage of African American as East Cleveland. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like racism has played any role in either investment or disinvestment, or any of the, I mean, we're going to talk about other entities and other institutions in a little bit, but do you feel like that is on a structural level played a role in kind of the problems that face East Cleveland now?
Well, first of all, I think racism plays a role in everything we do. It's like the paw. I mean, it's everywhere. It's insidious. It's in things both consciously and unconsciously, mostly unconscious. And some of it's kind of like light coming from the sun that reaches here, like I don't know how long after what, a light year after it leaves. So the racism that happened 100 years ago is still operating and infecting the things we do today. And then you compound that with current forms of racism. So I think definitely it impacts. I also think that another analogy that comes to mind is when people say that current African art looks like Picasso, and I say, well, Picasso went to Africa and looked at African art, copied it, brought it here. Then, artists always absorb what's ever in their surroundings. So you get this multiple layer of, does racism make the kid walk down the street and throw garbage on the ground in the black community? Yes and no. Yes and no. There's certainly, we have agency, we have power to change our lives and to change what we do, but we are also infected by this thing that I wish we could get rid of.
Okay.
And that goes for the institutions as well. So once you get an institution that says, like County did around the issue of the lead abatement, it's so hard working with those people. Now, does those people mean because they're black? Or does it mean because somebody in the mix was asking for a little extra something on the side in order to move the paper along? Or does it mean both? Does it mean it's hard working with those people because it's a small town and that's different than working with a larger town that has a lot of bureaucracy already in place to make things happen? It's all of that.
So how has inequality impacted you personally?
Oh, the first time I went to the federal building, I couldn't put a dime in the phone machine. And it only cost a dime in those days because it was put so high, I couldn't reach it. You want to talk about inequality? Let's talk about being left-handed. Let's talk about being under 5 feet tall. Let's talk about being black. Let's talk about being a woman. Let's talk about being a lesbian. All of those things make it unequal because equality, for the most part, is based in this country on who is in the majority. And then we make up reasons why it's reasonable. And then when a group of people yell loud enough or push hard enough, they make exceptions that fit the folks that aren't in the majority.
Can you think of any specific instances that kind of illustrate the way inequality has impacted you?
Well, I just gave one that you are
Well,
ignoring, I guess, because
No,
it seems silly, but if
No,
you can imagine how that feels.
I think that there's a lot of ableism in our society and that we don't.
Well, I'm
think
not
about.
disabled. It's not about ableism. It's about choice of where you put it so that everyone can access it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that's about.
Yeah, I wasn't referring to it as ableism, but I was just thinking about the different expectations we have from people's bodies.
Mm-hmm. So your question was about.
Oh, I was just wondering if you had another example that would, I guess, your example was specifically referring to one aspect of your character that led to the inequality.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I'm going to push on the fact that you represent that you sit at the interstice.
I do, and I'm very much aware of all the pieces that come into that intersection. So when I was growing up, children were beaten for using their left hand because it's only 5% of the population, and it was seen as a demonic thing in many places, particularly in Catholic schools, but even in public schools. They were actually hit for using their left hand. That's very real for me. I'm left-handed. It's very real for me that I couldn't reach the telephone in a public place that I pay for because it's the federal building. It's very real for me when I'm told that if I were married, a married woman doesn't have the same rights as a married man, or that women should be seen and not heard in the church or in the this or in the that. It's very real for me. Those are just as real for me as racism issues, and they all sort of mix together to form the hurdles that I have to jump in my life. So, that's just as real for me as being punched in the face and called the N-word. Or going to a lesbian bar when I don't drink, because that's the only place in those many years ago, we're talking 84, 83, where all of the bars for lesbians were owned by guys who purportedly were part of the mafia. And, it's just no other place to meet, criminalizing being lesbian. All of those things are very real for me. And people can argue about what dogs were sicked on people and what not, but there are lots of people who are dead because they were lesbian or gay. And it may not be the same, I reject the notion of prioritizing discrimination. I reject it because it's a mistake. Once you do that and you start seeing your troubles aren't as bad as mine, then you miss the point of changing a society so that nobody is hurt like that. And you don't lose racism, it just flips into another ism that harms somebody else. And that doesn't change society. That just gets the target off you. So that's how I see it. Maybe I
in there. I wanted to.
Maybe
I wasn't trying to needle you.
Maybe I wouldn't see it that way if I were taller or
Right-handed.
or white or right-handed or whatever. Maybe I wouldn't see it that way. I don't know, but I know I do. And so whenever I fight about injustice, it's because I want to see the beloved community. So
how has inequality impacted the city of East Cleveland?
I think there's an expectation of lower standards. And the expectation is not only from observers from the outside in, but also from the inside out. And it's totally unnecessary. We have some wonderful potential leaders in this community. We have some really great people who care a lot. And at the same time, we accept behaviors. I think we accept behaviors that if white people did it, we would be enraged. I really do. And since most of our leadership is, if not all, is African American, we need to take a look at that. It's a mistake to give people a pass because they're the same race as you. And it's unnecessary because we've got enough people in this community who could lead East Cleveland, or could have. I'm not sure whether we can anymore. I really just don't know whether this is something we can pull ourselves out of because it's sunk so low. And we have so few resources and so little faith that we can bring the kinds of institutions and money, resources, financial resources, into our town to build a pot of money to make the changes happen that we need to have happen. I was talking with someone the other day after going to City Hall and leaving it. I was talking to someone about that. Years ago, there was an offer of resources to build a new City Hall. And at the time, lots of folks said, oh, that's a waste of money, let's use it somewhere else. I don't know where the money was used. I don't know if we ever got it. But I do know that it would have made me feel a lot more special if I'd walked into City Hall that was a different City Hall than what I see. You know, the floors are dirty because they can't afford to hire the people, enough staff to keep it clean. The jail I would never want someone to be in. You know, things are falling apart. It's cold and you know, air blowing through, space heaters everywhere because people are. It just is not that's not the City Hall that people think of and look at with respect and awe. Your seat of government is supposed to be a place that people walk in and respect. Is that the primary thing we should be doing with our money? I don't know, but it would have made people feel a little better. Even the new white building, the Stephanie Tubbs Jones building, makes people feel a little better because they saw something new happen in their city. But I don't know whether it's too late. I know the change is going to have to be a dramatic one. I know that if we had, I travel a lot, and I've been to several little boutique hotels. They're not fancy. Well, the hotel that we stayed in, I was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention the year that Obama was chosen to run as a candidate for president. So it was in Colorado. And Ohio chose the hotel. Each state chooses its own hotel. Ohio chose a low-budget hotel, actually. But it was the cutest little thing. It had every floor the theme was games. So there were all kinds of games throughout the whole building. You could sit down with somebody you didn't know and play a game of checkers or play, just a variety of different games, some children's games, some adult games, but it's just quite wonderful. And the hotel was decorated with games. And I thought, that's one. There's others in New Orleans. There are lots of little boutique hotels. They're kind of quaint and cute, and people want to go back to them because they're not fancy. It's not the big, Hyatt Regency or whatever. It's just a sweet little place. And East Cleveland could have a few of those. East Cleveland could have at least one of those that would allow parents whose children are at Case to come and stay overnight inexpensively. Doesn't cost a lot to do that. But what do we have? We have a hotel that's people think is known for having prostitutes, 15-minute hotel. That's what we have. That's ridiculous. When we could have something else that close to a university, How do you get a hotel chain to invest in putting one of their hotels in East Cleveland? You have to convince them that they won't be destroyed when they do it, that it will be successful. You have to have a whole campaign. You have to have a campaign. And that, it's not high-priced jobs, but it's jobs. The cleaning crew, the food service, the people that work at the front desk, all those are people who could be hired from East Clevelanders. I don't see us doing that. Maybe it's happening, but I don't see us doing it. And I don't see an overall campaign, which I should know about if it's happening. Because then when I travel, I become an ambassador for the city. you know. So, you know, if we all felt as though we were ambassadors for the city of East Cleveland, this whole business of being so enclosed or standoffish, as my grandmother might say, or reluctant to engage with the larger world is something we're going to have to get over, because we need the larger world. Now, of course, it wouldn't be fair if we needed them and they didn't need us. Well, yeah, they do need us. Many people don't know that yet. Some do know it. But, you know, in East Cleveland, they're always talking about how much University Circle needs the land in East Cleveland. They don't just need the land in East Cleveland. They need the people of East Cleveland, you know? But in order for us to be fully engaged, we have to also recognize how much we need them to open our doors to the world. We just had an international gay games here, and not a single thing happened in East Cleveland. Right down the street from where all the swimmers were swimming at Case's pool and all of that stuff, right across, right over the bridge or under the bridge. You know, there was no reason for them to come to East Cleveland. We could have had concerts in the library auditorium. Nobody seemed to be interested. All of which brings resources into our town, and we need that. I'll give you another example that isn't just about blacks and whites. For 36 years now, the NAACP has had an annual competition that involves 9th through 12th graders in 35 different areas. It's an Olympics kind of thing, but it's academic and cultural and technological. It's called ACSO. Academic, forgotten all the academic, cultural, technological, scientific Olympics. And kids from all over northeastern Ohio compete for a spot to go to the national NAACP convention to then again compete nationally to win awards. Until I served on the board of the library, until that year, which was maybe 3 years ago, not a single East Clevelander had ever participated in that. Now, you can't get much more race-focused than the National Organization for the Advancement of Colored People. And yet East Cleveland had not participated. So they participated that year. We were able to get some students to come from, they were all seniors, the ones who won locally. And 3 of them were sent to the national, all expenses paid, to the national convention in Dallas. They were so proud of themselves. They loved it. One's product was in architecture, I believe. Another was in physics. So it was all science. It's all sciences and technology. And the physics person won. She won a bronze medal, and one of the students who was able to go said, if I'd only known about this when I was in 9th grade, I would have competed every year, and this year I would have won. Well, how can you be so enclosed that you don't know what the NAACP is doing, and you pride yourself as being a city that's mostly black? That's what I'm talking about. It's so narrow, so enclosed. I think if people had seen the resources and the uses of those resources of county libraries, they wouldn't have been so averse to having a library that had benefit of those resources. Somehow it got twisted to think that the library was going to be stolen from them, which makes no sense to me. Does that answer whatever your question was when you started?
Well, we were talking about how inequality has impacted East Cleveland, but I think that does get to kind of thinking about like root causes and, things that have to be addressed in order to facilitate change.
Well, in the entrenchment, the regionalistic idea, the almost xenophobia, and I'm not sure it's true of individual African Americans in the city of East Cleveland. I get the impression that lots of people reach outside of East Cleveland for their own individual lives, but as a group, as a city, we don't do that. I used to go to committee meetings all over Ohio, and I'd see maybe one or two people from East Cleveland there, maybe not at all. I remember thinking, I bet he's going to run for mayor when I saw Gary Norton at the first meeting of some political group or other, and because he was looking for outside support then, and I'm not even sure he was on city council at that point. But we need to do that as a city, feel proud enough and sturdy enough about ourselves to not just fight when somebody writes something in the Plain Dealer we don't like, but to step up and step out as a city and do things with other cities. Feel proud enough of it to do that.
So you talked about a couple of times that the community fought for something. Can you expound more on? You said you were involved in the Huron Road protest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, once it became a public knowledge that first that Huron Road was going to close its trauma care. That was the first shot across the bow. I went to all the meetings of community to talk about it. I listened to Dr. Caius talk when he first talked about that. Very quickly, it devolved further into the whole hospital was going. And on the one hand, I'm a lawyer. I know it's private property. I know they can do with it what they want. I thought that if we worked collectively, not just in East Cleveland, but with the city of Cleveland and the city of Cleveland Heights, and possibly even University Heights, that we might be able to put social pressure on the city to leave at least a limited use hospital there. And so I became involved in it, but I didn't have great hopes because it is private property and people can move their business where they want to move it. The post office also, I participated, but not quite as much. I think I knew that the U.S. Post Office was doing a lot of things around consolidation, and I knew that for at least a decade before they did it in East Cleveland. I've had clients whose jobs were being eliminated. I've had other clients whose jobs were eliminated as soon as they retired. When they retired, nothing else was going to come. And you could just see the handwriting on the wall that they were trying something that was much more automated and less people sensitive. So it didn't surprise me that East Cleveland was one of the sites. And I was actually happy to see East Clevelanders step up and say, no, no, that's not right. We can't do that. And I don't think it's not completely closed. I mean, the mail isn't delivered from there anymore, I don't think. But at least it's a place where people can go walk in their neighborhood to go to the post office, and that's a good thing. As I said before, I thought the community's notion about the library was misguided and misinformed, and that's an and you know, my spouse Mary was one of the people who served on Ichabod Flewellen's board way long time ago, and so she's very much aware of the historic resources that he gathered over many years. I mean, he has eaten Thanksgiving dinner in our home, so I mean, you know, we knew him pretty well, and she knew him very well. But if it's not well maintained and not cared for and not protected, no matter what you have, it becomes, if you're not careful, it can be wasted. So we don't want it to be wasted. And when you have limited resources, some things have to be wasted. So I guess what I'm getting to is that you have to not only be aware of what you have potentially, but you have to be aware of how to keep it and maintain it. It's like, you know, you can be a teenage mother and have all the love and care and desire to raise your child well, but if you don't have the resources, something's got to go. Something's got to be shifted in order to make that happen. And many times you need other people to make that happen. So, fighting for the independence of the library, which many people called to keep our library, as though a library is going to go pick up and go somewhere, I thought was misguided.
What do you think, given those three examples, what do you think about the potential for East Clevelanders to come together in the name of a different struggle? like what is their potential for collective action?
Well, what I've seen is a lot of noise, short-term response, and then nothing. And that is troublesome. That is troubling. We look for resources, things that we can make use of in the long term. The school's academic record is abominable. And I see people going to school board meetings, you know, they might rail about one thing or another, but it's been bad for a long time. What's going to help it? I want something to help it. You know, we've lived without a swimming pool or any beautiful recreational space for our young children for a long time. We collected money to send our marching band to China. Why can't we collect money to have a school playground that's not covered in concrete or tarred over at Prospect Elementary School. Why is that? You know, this business of standing with placards in front of the 5 seconds on TV protesting one thing or another is fine if that's just your rallying cry for further action. But if that's all there is, people soon begin to see that that's all there is, and they just wait for it to pass over, which is kind of what happened with the hospital. So, you know, what does it take? Sustained, committed action by people who know that they don't know everything and can learn from this person or that person or other people. That's what it takes. With a huge dose of ethics thrown in so that people aren't bought or sell out because they can grab something for themselves. That's what it takes.
So how have surrounding institutions and cities impacted East Cleveland?
Cities and institutions, did you say? Well, I'm sitting in one, Case Western, that used to tell its students, I don't know whether it tells its incoming fresh persons not to go beyond the bridge, but they used to do that, which means that if they couldn't go beyond the bridge to even visit East Cleveland, they certainly weren't likely to relocate there to work in the schools or to do whatever after they graduate or come and play or whatever. I lived for a year in Cleveland Heights on a street that the lower end of it was East Cleveland. So same street, and this was years ago, but I have more recently heard some of the administrators in that city in their public statements worry that they didn't want their city to turn into an East Cleveland, which is for me is code for classist, racist stuff. Then, let's see, Cleveland itself. Aside from University Circle, I don't know that Cleveland has tried to share some of its resources with the city of East Cleveland. I think it has. I think the sewage system is now actually run by the city of Cleveland. You know, East Cleveland is kind of surrounded on 3 sides, I think, by Cleveland, and then Cleveland Heights on one side. So, institutions. I think in terms of religious institutions, the Catholic Church has removed its church from here. Is that true? I don't know whether St. Philomena is still working, an active congregation or not. But you're talking about institutions that are outside of East Cleveland that impact upon East Cleveland?
Mm-hmm. Cleveland Clinic, maybe?
Well, Cleveland Clinic we've talked about ad nauseum. I mean, that was the elephant in the middle of the living room that had so many workers. Even if the workers did not live in East Cleveland, they paid taxes because of their work at Cleveland Clinic. I think there are institutions that have worked on behalf of various disenfranchised groups or groups in need of services. Whether it's Berea Children's Home or which has a new name now, and I've blocked on that what that is, but or other places that have come to work for in behalf of our youth population or elders. Our criminal justice system impacts on East Cleveland inadvertently because so many people who were incarcerated for sex crimes find their way using addresses here in East Cleveland because I guess it's an easier place to relocate than someplace else that's a little bit more watchful or protective of its children and elders.
When you say our criminal justice system, do you mean like the counties or?
The county and once a person comes out of prison, if they have been adjudicated to be sexual predators or sexual, if they've been convicted of a sex crime, then there are some parameters by which they must live. And I'm not saying that the criminal justice system tells them to move to East Cleveland. That's not what I mean. But for whatever reason, East Cleveland has become a haven or a focal point, a place where they can more easily move. And that has to do with our interaction and how we regulate things. I totally believe in people getting a chance to be returning citizens. But I'm not seeing us do very much to support protecting children and elders from further assaults by people who apparently have mental health issues around rape and sexual assault. So in other words, what I'm saying is we have a lot of apartment buildings in this town, and then we have a lot of vacant properties in this town that aren't being either torn down or repaired and used, which makes this a town very ripe for continued inappropriate action by people who already have a problem, and it's been proven they have a problem. So it's a low-income area, so it's easier to move here. There's far less protestation. Nobody's protesting that. I don't hear it anywhere. If they are, they're not saying it very loud because I would hear it. So people gravitate to places that are easier to move to. And then we set up a situation by not tearing down old buildings that makes it even more dangerous. By the same token, we have citizens here that are wonderful people and shouldn't have to endure that kind of risk.
So all that being said, what is your vision for the future of East Cleveland?
My primary concern is not with any particular institution of East Cleveland, but with the people as a whole and in particular. So administratively, I think it would be wise to use or combine or interact with other cities that have resources that we don't have to make best use of the resources that they do have. A classic example is with the sewage system, which needs a lot of work and could benefit from maybe being, we had sewage running down our street one day. Well, not one day, several weeks. more than once, more than one, I think 2 or 3 years in the summer, and because our infrastructure is weak. So if we can find ways to build alliances or share in resources with other municipalities to make our economic situation a little less heavy, that would be great. I'm not talking about merging the city into another city. I'm talking about sharing resources. And I think that would be of great benefit to all involved. And it would slow down the degradation of the city. So if you don't have resources, you have to let things go. And if you let things go, then other things fall because of those things. So that would be so that's like a Band-Aid, but it's a good Band-Aid.
What issues do you think would have to be addressed for that to happen?
Well, one of the things that would have to happen is an increased respect for the integrity of our town. And that's not just good PR. That's, when you say you're going to do something, you do it. And you're honest and your character goes before you. A few years back, an organization that I'm affiliated with, I'm on the board of the Cleveland Stonewall Democrats, I think as I said to you, offered, and we have several lawyers that are on that board, we offered and did give assist to the city of East Cleveland in writing its human rights ordinance. We would, we're 3 of our board members live in the city of East Cleveland, and we're happy to help in any way that we can. We look for integrity, and we look for honesty. And so when the city council president asked us to help write a human rights ordinance, we did that, and then they passed it. That's that's what I'm talking about. Real action to be able to extend your honest communication and connection over a long period of time to get a job done, so that when people walk away, they can say, they said they would do it and they did it. That's how you build. And in business, they put a price of value on that kind of good identity, good character. When you sell a business, part of what they buy is the reputation of the business. And that's what we have to build. We have to rebuild that in East Cleveland. We have to rebuild our good character so that other institutions outside of us can trust that or individuals who want to invest can trust that it's going to, it's not going to fall apart. And that means putting our priorities in order. I went to an audit meeting not too long ago where I heard that we only had a part-time finance director, but I noticed that we